Miss Marple's sharp eye is drawn to a child's doll's house, where an innocent toy conceals a deadly secret, a hidden dagger that links a quiet village tragedy to a cold-blooded killer. Chapter 1. The doll's house at Elderberry Fair. It was the sort of day that made even the most hardened cynic pause and appreciate the charm of English village life. The summer sun filtered softly through ancient oak trees, dappling the green with patterns of gold and shadow. St. Mildred's church bell rang gently in the distance, signaling 2 o'clock. Birds chirped merrily, and the scent of rose jam and scones filled the warm air. The Elderberry Fair, held once a year on the vicarage lawn, was in full swing. Tables brimmed with homemade chutneys, patchwork quilts, and bric-a-brac of every description. Children darted between booths with sticky fingers and wide eyes. There was a raffle beside the cake tent, and the ladies of the parish, mostly wide-hatted and smiling, sold slices of Victoria sponge with military efficiency. It was, to all appearances, a perfectly ordinary village fete. Miss Marple, in her customary dove-gray cardigan and straw hat trimmed with faded cornflowers, sat politely beside the crocheted lace display, her eyes moving gently across the crowd. Her knitting lay idle in her lap. She was not, as many believed, a passive old dear simply watching the world go by. She was, in her quiet way, cataloging every flicker of tension, every furtive glance, every misplaced politeness. Near the rose trellis, a small crowd had gathered around a marvel, an exquisitely crafted doll's house, a grand Georgian replica complete with chandeliers, 4-poster beds, and miniature portraits no larger than a fingernail. Children gawked at the tiny furnishings. Their mothers admired the craftsmanship. Miss Partridge, the retired governess who donated the piece to the auction, beamed with modest pride. "It belonged to my mother," she explained to a curious couple. "A family heirloom. Quite delicate, but I'm afraid it's just gathering dust now." No one noticed the man standing somewhat apart. He wore a brown linen suit and a neat mustache. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his pale blue eyes were fixed on the doll's house, not with wonder, but intensity. Miss Marple did notice. She noticed the way he flinched when a child's hand came too close to the house's little red door. She noticed how his jaw clenched as the auctioneer leaned over to inspect it more closely. The bidding for the doll's house was scheduled for 3 o'clock. At precisely 10 minutes to, the village doctor, George Lambert, came hurrying across the lawn, his face flushed beneath his straw hat. "Miss Partridge," he said a little too loudly, "may I have a word?" She looked surprised, but acquiesced, her wrinkled hand clutching her reticule as she followed him toward the edge of the crowd. It was mere minutes later that a cry rang out. The crowd turned. Someone had collapsed near the doll's house. People surged forward. There was confusion, murmurs, then a woman's shriek. "Good heavens, it's Mr. Templeton!" It was indeed Mr. Horace Templeton, a solicitor from the neighboring town of Lidicott, who had recently retired to the village. He lay crumpled beside the doll's house, one hand outstretched toward it, his face deathly pale and his lips tinged blue. The vicar's wife bent over him, fluttering with the best intentions and absolutely no idea what to do. Dr. Lambert elbowed his way through the throng, knelt, and felt the man's wrist. After a long moment, he looked up, his face tight. "He's dead." A gasp traveled like wind through the garden. The children were ushered away by their mothers. Someone covered the body with a picnic blanket. Miss Partridge, having returned during the commotion, stood rooted to the spot, one trembling hand covering her mouth. "But how?" someone whispered. "He just dropped," said another. Was it the heat, or his heart? Miss Marple rose slowly, her knitting now forgotten. She took one careful step toward the doll's house, but paused. Her expression, though placid, bore the faintest furrow of concern. Not fear concern, because she had seen something a moment before the collapse. Not what happened, not even who did what, but something out of place, something she had no words for yet. The villagers, flustered and murmuring, began retreating to safer corners of the lawn, away from the tragic scene. A few tried to continue their business at the jam stalls and bunting competitions. But the spirit of the day had died with Mr. Templeton. Heart failure, said the doctor under his breath to Miss Marple as he stood beside her, arms folded. Poor devil, looked healthy enough to me this morning, but who knows? HMM, said Miss Marple vaguely, her eyes on the doll's house, and that was all she said. But she kept watching. The doll's house, it seemed to her, held more than little beds and porcelain teacups. It held a secret, and someone, she suspected, had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure it stayed hidden. Until now. Chapter 2. The village reacts. News of Mr. Templeton's sudden death spread through Little Dismore with almost palpable speed. By mid-afternoon, the vicarage lawn was nearly deserted of its gaiety. The bunting drooped limply overhead, and the tea urn cooled untouched, as the village constable, Harold Finch, gently guided the last of the lingering onlookers toward the exit. Snippets of gossip began to stitch themselves into a single, uneasy narrative. Mrs. Agnes Fletcher, whose prized scones had gone unsold for the first time since she began attending the fair, found herself murmuring in the church porch to Mrs. Winifred Potts, the council clerk. Heart attack, they say for a man his age. To sudden, don't you think, Winnie? Mrs. Fletcher dabbed at her pince-nez. I saw him standing by that doll's house just moments before. Looked as robust as ever. Mrs. Potts, adjusting her prim bonnet, shook her head. The doctor insists there was no sign of illness earlier. But you know, Agnes, stranger things have happened. Poor tempers, old grudges. Agnes raised an eyebrow. You think someone wanted him dead? Now, Winifred tutted, glancing furtively toward the vicarage steps where a pale blue envelope sat unattended on the ledge. I'm not saying that, only that a man like Mr. Templeton, with his reputation for, well, a certain forthrightness, might have made enemies. Meanwhile, at the vicar's house itself, Reverend Jonathan Pritchard was doing his best to preserve decorum. He and his wife, Marjorie, stood on their front porch, peering anxiously through lace curtains. They both had the look of hosts who could not quite decide whether to invite guests in or ask them to leave. The vicar's wife, ever mindful of parish etiquette, had already dispatched a servant for more blankets and brandy for the shock. Dr. Lambert, she had instructed firmly, yet she could not bring herself to cross the lawn and look at the upturned face of the stranger. They had summoned to their village fate. Miss Marple, seated on the low stone wall beneath a birch tree, was neither gossiping nor fluttering with distress. Instead, she studied the daisied grass at her feet, as though the pattern of petals might yield some insight. At her side, young Martha Price, daughter of the local baker, clutched her mother's sleeve and whispered, Miss Marple, are you frightened? Not frightened, dear, Miss Marple replied softly, her knitting needles clicking together in a delicate rhythm. Merely curious. She smiled at the child, who looked both reassured and bewildered by the calm in the old lady's eyes. Word reached Miss Partridge, still trembling near the doll's house, that the auction would be postponed indefinitely. She sank onto a folding chair, pressing a white-gloved hand to her chest. My poor mother's heirloom, she lamented. I cursed the day I let it leave the drawing room. Behind her, the stranger in the brown linen suit, Mr. Lawrence Hayward, as he would later introduce himself, approached with slow, measured steps. He wore an air of polite concern, yet his eyes flicked constantly toward the little red door of the doll's house. Miss Partridge, he said in a low voice, might I inquire whether that house was truly the last item in the auction? I had hoped to bid. Miss Partridge looked up, startled. Yes, Mr. Hayward, it was the final lot. But the circumstances are indeed unusual. Hayward agreed, folding his arms behind his back. "I am sorry about Mr. Templeton. A tragedy, to be sure." He hesitated, then asked, "Did Dr. Lambert examine the house itself? Perhaps there was something amiss, poisonous paint or a hidden mechanism." Miss Partridge looked horrified. "Poisonous paint? Hidden mechanism? Mr. Hayward, this is an innocent toy, or nearly so." Hayward inclined his head. "Forgive me. I merely thought, given the odd timing." He trailed off, and Miss Partridge, flustered, turned away to join Mrs. Potts, who was directing the removal of the body. At dusk, the villagers gathered at the Crown and Thistle pub, as if drawn by some unseen force of communal anxiety. They filled 2 long tables in the back room, orders of ale and tea streaming in from the bar. Mrs. Fletcher, flushed with indignation, began, "I'm telling you, it wasn't natural. I heard Mr. Templeton arguing with someone on the telephone only yesterday." Sounded heated. "Telephone?" asked Mr. Edgar Smelly, the grocer, swirling his mug thoughtfully. "In his own home?" "Yes, at odd hours," Agnes insisted. He was quite insistent. "Asked for papers, financial documents." By the sound of it, Mrs. Potts scribbled in her notebook. "Financial documents. Templeton did have a hand in drawing up the will for old Mrs. Cumberbatch. He's the one who advised her on her trust fund." "Oh," exclaimed Mr. Smelly. "Do you think there's a connection? A dispute over inheritance?" "No idea," said Mrs. Potts, tapping her pen. "But I do know that Mrs. Cumberbatch has been unsettled since that will was read last month. She's claimed several times that someone's tampered with her possessions, like that doll's house," said Mr. Smelly, lowering his voice. "Imagine someone hiding something inside. Poison, Dagger, who knows?" A chill passed through the room, but Miss Marple, who had quietly joined the circle, raised her hand for attention. "My dears," she said, her voice surprisingly firm for such a gentle tone, "we mustn't jump to conclusions." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, as they tended to do. It was a marvel, in a way. No one thought Miss Marple could solve a crime, but everyone was willing to listen while she demurred about theories. Mr. Templeton, she looked at each face in turn, was indeed an exacting man. He took his work seriously and, occasionally, with less charity than was wise. But I suspect there is more than one secret in this village, more than one reason for someone to wish him ill. Mrs. Fletcher sniffed. "Seemed to me that the only secret he kept was how he made money off the old folk." Miss Marple smiled, though it did not reach her eyes. "And yet," she said, "Mrs. Potts reminds us that wills and trusts can be tricky. But I would ask you to recall what happened by the doll's house. There was a moment quite brief when I saw something fall to the ground. Double quotes. Mrs. Potts leaned forward. "Something fall. A very small object," Miss Marple continued. "It glinted in the sun, and I thought it might be of significance. But by the time I looked again, it was gone." A hush descended. "What did it look like?" Edgar Smelly asked. Miss Marple pursed her lips. "Difficult to say. Perhaps a bit like a tiny blade or the tip of one." She paused, observing their reactions. Some glanced at the staircase leading to the vicarage porch. Others shifted uncomfortably. "I intend to return to the scene at first light," she concluded. "If you would be so kind, do not touch anything. If someone did wish to harm Mr. Templeton, they might well have planned more than one trick." She rose, with help from Martha Price, and made her way toward the door. The villagers watched her go, wondering if the quiet little old lady had perhaps stumbled upon something darker than any of them realized. That evening, the lanterns in Little Dismore cast long shadows. The Crown and Thistle emptied, and hushed voices followed patrons out onto the cobbled street. Behind the curtained windows of their homes, people lay awake, pondering Miss Marple's words. In the doctor's residence, Dr. Lambert reviewed his notes once more. In the parsonage, Reverend Pritchard and his wife said prayers for the repose of Mr. Templeton's soul. In the baker's house, the Price family quietly clutched crucifixes, and in the lone chamber of the vicarage attic, Miss Partridge wept softly into a lace handkerchief, recalling for the first time that her mother's heirloom had been locked with a tiny clasp, the sort that might conceal a slender instrument. She stared at the rich mahogany wood of the doll's house and shivered, for in that clasp, she now remembered, was a slender silver dagger long thought lost to time. Ever since her mother's niece eloped and vanished decades ago, Little Dismore seemed a village of gentle souls. Yet Miss Marple, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders, knew that even the gentlest fouet could conceal the sharpest edges of human nature. And she wondered, was the dagger hidden in the doll's house the very thing that ended Mr. Templeton's life? Tomorrow would bring answers or more questions. But as the night deepened, one truth remained clear in Little Dismore. No one's secret was completely safe from discovery. Chapter 3. Early investigation. Before dawn's first light had fully faded, Miss Marple was already on her way to the vicarage lawn. The mist clung to the grass in wisps that curled around the slender legs of the fairground chairs, and dew weighed heavily upon the petals of stray daisies. The hush was profound, broken only by the distant crowing of a rooster and the soft crunch of her slippers. On the gravel path, she carried with her a small lantern and a tape measure, tools neither ostentatious nor obtrusive, and a quiet determination to observe Dot at the edge of the lawn. The scene of the tragedy seemed almost unreal. The toppled folding chair still lay where Mr. Templeton had fallen, its seat slightly askew. A low wooden platform marked the auction days, and on it, the doll's house stood solitary and solemn, its miniature windows dark, its little red door closed as though guarding some terrible secret. Miss Marple knelt beside the house, her lantern held carefully to one side so as not to cast a harsh glare. With the tape measure, she noted the distance between the days and the chair just under 2 paces. She murmured to herself, one short stride, perhaps, if one is seated hastily and leans forward. She tapped the edge of the days gently with her knitting needle. See how the varnish has chipped here just by the corner. Perhaps someone leaned too heavily, or perhaps something was pressed against it. Her eyes traced the narrow brass clasp at the back of the doll's house. It was tiny, intricately wrought, as though meant to be both decorative and functional. She touched it with a gloved finger. It felt cool and slightly loose, as though it had been jiggled. Curious, she whispered, as if someone tried to open it in haste. She straightened and stepped back. The lawn was empty now, the morning fair tents long since folded and the bunting taken down. Behind her, the vicar's gardener appeared, pushing a wheelbarrow of discarded teacups and picnic crumbs. He glanced at her with a quizzical expression. Miss Marple, he ventured, I didn't expect to see you here so early. Good morning, Mr. Collins, she replied, her tone genial. I beg your pardon for the intrusion. I wished to see the scene before it was disturbed. Might I ask if anything else has been moved? He peered around. Not that I'm aware of, madam. Constable Finch took measurements for the report, and Dr. Lambert collected the body. Other than that, the place has been left as it was. Thank you, she said. I shall be most discreet. She offered him a small nod and returned her attention to the house. Moments later, another figure approached, Constable Finch himself, his uniform rumpled from a restless night. He carried a notebook and a pencil behind his ear, like a schoolboy prepared for any exercise. Miss Marple, he said, clearing his throat. You're here early. She smiled. Curiosity, Mr. Finch. One must be thorough. He jotted something down. I'm afraid the official inquiry will start soon. I'll need to resume my duties. Of course, she rose gracefully. Might I trouble you for a small favor? Would you allow me to measure the position of that chair relative to the days? I wish to be precise in my observations. He hesitated, then said, "Very well. I'll stand aside." Finch cleared a space, and Miss Marple measured twice to ensure accuracy. Afterward, she tucked away her tape measure and addressed him. "Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Templeton's demeanor when you first found him?" Finch frowned. He was sitting, leaning forward as though examining the doll's house. His expression was pained as if he'd felt a sudden, sharp twinge. "But I can't say much more." She nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you. You've been most helpful." Finch tipped his cap and hurried away, presumably to prepare his statement. Miss Marple lingered only a moment longer before making her way down the winding lane, toward Miss Partridge's cottage. A light glowed in the window of the thatched roof, and as she rounded the corner of Climbing Roses, the retired governess opened the door, her eyes red-rimmed. "Miss Partridge, I hope I am not troubling you," Miss Marple began quietly. "Not at all, do come in," Partridge said. Stepping aside, she led her guest into a cozy sitting room, where a small fire crackled and the battered tea set was already laid out. "I find freshest gossip flows best with tea," she observed, offering a cup. Miss Marple accepted. "Thank you. I hope you slept well." Partridge shook her head. "Not a wink. I lay awake thinking, who would harm Henry? Why must a harmless doll's house be at the center of tragedy?" She paused, her voice faltering. "Come look at it again, if you would." They returned outside this time in daylight, and Partridge pointed to a narrow bench beside the lane. "My tools were here," she said, indicating a small leather pouch. "Yesterday, I brought out my fine tweezers and a magnifying glass to clean the silverwork." She unclasped the pouch, revealing a single pair of tweezers and a loop. "I left them here while I attended the raffle tent, but when I returned after the incident they were gone." Miss Marple examined the spot. The grass was slightly pressed, as though by a slender object. "And you did not see them again?" she asked. "No," Partridge whispered. "I searched everywhere." Miss Marple nodded, eyes narrowing. "Thank you, Mrs. Partridge. That is all I require for now." She slipped a hand into her pocket and produced a small folded note. "I also found this under the days." She handed it to Partridge, who opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a scrap of paper, torn crudely, bearing the letters "come" in an uneven script. Partridge gasped, "C.U.M. Cumberbatch." Just then, a motor car turned into the lane. Miss Marple and Partridge stepped aside as Mrs. Florence Cumberbatch alighted, her fur-trimmed coat and pillbox hat unmistakable. She looked every inch the aristocrat who had once presided over grand soirees in London. Now, her face was drawn and haggard. "Mrs. Partridge," she said curtly, "I trust you are making progress?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "We are simply exchanging facts, Mrs. Cumberbatch." Cumberbatch's eyes flicked to the doll's house. "My good woman," she said to Partridge, "I want that house returned to my possession immediately. It is a family heirloom, far too precious for this charade." Partridge bowed her head. "As you wish, Mrs. Cumberbatch." She closed the leather pouch with a snap and retreated into her cottage, leaving the two other women alone beneath the Climbing Roses. Mrs. Cumberbatch's gaze was sharp. "That note you found it under the days, with my name on it?" Miss Marple held up a hand. "We do not yet know, but the letters "come" could be from your name." Cumberbatch's hand trembled briefly before she regained her composure. "I had nothing to do with the man's death. Henry Templeton was my solicitor only in the sense that he once drew up my late husband's will. I have had no contact with him for weeks." Miss Marple studied her. "And yet you have returned to Little Dismore only now, and in strong emotion." "My husband's estate matters required me to come here," Cumberbatch said stiffly. "I wish to resolve everything and leave this village of gossip behind." With that, she swept past Miss Marple and climbed into her car. As the engine purred to life, Miss Marple saw her clutch the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. Returning slowly to the days, Miss Marple counted the nails along the base of the doll's house. They were unremarkable save for one, which was slightly bent inward. She pressed her knitting needle against the bent head. "Someone forced that nail," she murmured, and thus made the clasp unstable. She walked the perimeter of the days, noting the disturbed earth where Finch had taken soil samples. At the back, near the clasp, she saw a faint smear of red, no brighter than rust, but unmistakable. Kneeling, she scraped at it with her fingernail. Dark crimson appeared, as though from old paint or perhaps even something more, rust or blood. She wondered as a sudden thought occurred to her. Retrieving a handkerchief, she dabbed at the smear. The red hue clung stubbornly. The body was removed in such haste, she thought, that evidence may have been overlooked. Pocketing the handkerchief, Miss Marple rose and took out her notebook. She made exact sketches of the clasp, the bent nail, the smear. She listed persons of interest: the governess, whose tools had vanished; Mrs. Cumberbatch, whose name was scrawled in mystery; Lawrence Hayward, who had inquired after hidden mechanisms; Dr. Lambert, whose morning visit to the vicarage seemed routine yet urgent; and Constable Finch, who seemed more troubled than protocol demanded. By mid-morning, she made her way to the Crown and Thistle, where a humble breakfast of scones and tea awaited her. The proprietor greeted her with a knowing smile. "Back so soon, Miss Marple?" She nodded. "I took the liberty of using your kitchen for tea." He blinked. "Very well." As she ate, she listened to the murmur of villagers. Some spoke of ghostly tales, of curses on antique heirlooms. Others speculated about scandalous debts. From a corner, she heard the baker, Mr. Price, chastising his daughter. "Martha, child, do not tell tales. You saw nothing, and you heard nothing." Martha, clutching her own teacup, stammered, "But Papa, I thought I saw someone by the days after the doctor left." "I'm sorry," Price dismissed her with a wave. Miss Marple leaned over. "May I speak with Martha for a moment?" He hesitated, then nodded. Martha approached, eyes wide and uncertain. "Yes, Miss Marple. Did you truly see someone after Dr. Lambert had gone?" Martha bit her lip. "Yes, it was nearly dawn. I came to fetch my mother's shawl. I thought I heard a soft scraping sound, so I peered around the trellis. I saw a figure crouched by the days wearing what looked like a brown coat and a hat." "A hat?" Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Describe the hat." "Soft felt with a narrow brim," Martha said. "Like Mr. Hayward's hat." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you, dear. You've been most helpful." She handed the child a silver shilling from her pocket, which Martha accepted with a relieved smile. Piecing together the fragments, Miss Marple sat back. Lawrence Hayward had been seen by the doll's house at least twice, once during the fair, once before dawn. Mrs. Partridge's tools were missing. Mrs. Cumberbatch's name implicated her loosely. Dr. Lambert had examined the body swiftly, possibly too swiftly, and Constable Finch, well, he had been unaccountably tense. She rose at last, sipping the last of her tea. "Time to pay a call on Dr. Lambert," she murmured. The doctor's surgery was a modest building of brick and ivy on Church Street. Miss Marple entered without knocking, as was her custom, and found Dr. Lambert poring over his morning mail. He looked up in polite surprise. "Miss Marple back so soon?" She laid a hand on the edge of his desk. "I hoped you could clarify something for me, Doctor. You pronounced Mr. Templeton's death an immediate heart failure." He nodded. "Yes, no signs of poisoning on preliminary examination, no discoloration, no odor." She produced the handkerchief with the red smear. "And blood doesn't smear like this, does it?" He peered at it. "No, that looks like iron oxide rust, perhaps. In other words, not relevant to his death." He gave a firm nod. "Indeed, you see, Miss Marple, there are those who fear the less sensational explanation. But I trust my diagnosis." She inclined her head. "I do too, Doctor. but suspects may prefer to misdirect attention toward a fanciful murder method rather than face a more mundane truth. He frowned. You're implying the cause of Mr. Templeton's death was natural, yet someone staged the scene to suggest otherwise? She allowed a small smile. Precisely. As she left the surgery, Miss Marple paused in the street, drawing in a deep breath of English air. The mystery was growing, threads weaving into a tapestry of motives and secrets. Her early investigation had uncovered more questions than answers, but she felt, as she often did, that the human heart revealed its patterns in the smallest of details: a bent nail, a smeared stain, a missing tool, returning home. She set her notes upon her writing desk and prepared to delve deeper into the lives of the villagers. For in Little Dismore, the crime may have been sudden, but the reasons behind it had been brewing for years. Miss Marple, settling into her favorite armchair by the window, closed her eyes for a moment and listened to the creaking of unseen floorboards, the whisper of the breeze through the hedges, the faint hum of human passion stirring once more. Tomorrow would bring confrontations and secrets, and Miss Marple would be ready. Chapter 4. First suspects. The following morning dawned clear and bright over Little Dismore, as though the sun itself insisted on piercing the veil of unease that had settled across the village. Miss Marple stepped beyond her gate with purposeful calm, knitting in hand, and set off toward Church Street. Her first call was to Lawrence Hayward's lodgings at the old rectory, where Dr. Lambert had once boarded before setting up his surgery. The rectory door stood ajar, revealing a hallway lined with somber portraits of long-dead vicars. Hayward himself appeared in a well-pressed brown coat, his head held in one hand. For a moment, he looked startled to see her at such an early hour. "Miss Marple," he greeted, inclining his head. "I trust you slept well?" She offered him a gentle smile. "Quite well, thank you. I hoped you might spare a few moments. I should like to discuss your presence at the fair and afterward." Hayward's pale blue eyes shifted, but his voice remained measured. "Of course. Please come in." Miss Marple entered a room sparsely furnished with a writing desk and 2 chairs. A single window overlooked a neat herb garden. Hayward settled into one chair opposite her, folding his hands on his lap. "You inquired about mechanisms in the doll's house," Miss Marple began. "I wondered what prompted your curiosity." He paused before replying. "I've had an interest in mechanical antiques for years. I collect music boxes, automata, doll carriages. When I saw the house, I thought there might be a hidden compartment, something of artistry worth preserving." "Admirable," she said. "Yet you remarked on the possibility of poison or danger, because one never knows," he said. "Antiques dealers have told tales of concealed blades, poison needles, curiosities designed to harm. If a family used the doll's house as a secret repository, it would hardly be the first." Miss Marple observed him carefully. "And did you examine the clasp yourself?" Hayward's throat worked slightly. "I lifted it, yes, to see if it would open easily. It was stiff, so I left it alone. I had no intention of tampering further." She nodded. "You had your magnifying glass?" He glanced as though recalling. "No, I did not have my instruments with me. I only used my fingers. In other words," she said with unforced calm, "you could not have prized the clasp in haste, just before Mr. Templeton collapsed." "I suppose not," he conceded, "but I did handle it." Miss Marple tapped her knitting needle lightly on the arm of her chair. "And afterwards, you returned at dawn, correct?" He frowned. "I wished to consult Miss Partridge, and she was still asleep. I thought a gentle knock at her door in the morning would avoid embarrassment." She studied him. "Yet you admitted hiding behind the rose trellis when the child saw you." Hayward's jaw clenched briefly. He looked away, as though recalling a private memory. Then he cleared his throat. "I did indeed pause there. I heard voices below voices speaking of Mrs. Cumberbatch. I did not wish to be seen eavesdropping." Miss Marple considered. And what did the voices say? Something about a clue Cumberbatch's name scrawled on a paper. They wondered if the note had fallen from a pocket or been planted. "Thank you, Mr. Hayward," she said. "That will be all for now." She rose and offered a curt nod. As she walked back out into the morning light, she made note in her mind. Hayward had motive to protect some secret mechanical knowledge, yet no clear motive to kill. His defensiveness, however, hinted at a deeper anxiety. Her next stop was the parsonage, to see the vicar and his wife. The Reverend Jonathan Pritchard answered the door, his black gown immaculate. Though his eyes bore the strain of sleepless nights, "Miss Marple," he said softly, "how may we help you today?" "If you please," she replied, stepping into the vestibule. "I would like to ask about Mr. Templeton's demeanor when you saw him yesterday." He led her into a small sitting room where Marjorie Pritchard served tea with trembling hands. "He spoke with my wife briefly," the vicar said. Henry Templeton approached her, said he had some urgent matter to discuss, something to do with Mrs. Cumberbatch's late husband's estate. Marjorie poured tea and handed Miss Marple a cup. "He seemed agitated," she said, "more than I have ever seen him. Yet when I asked if he was well, he forced a polite smile and excused himself." Miss Marple sipped the tea. "Did he mention what the urgency entailed?" The vicar exchanged glances with his wife. He hinted at a discrepancy, some document missing or altered, but he did not specify. Miss Marple set down her cup. "And did he touch the doll's house before he collapsed?" Marjorie Pritchard's eyes widened. "Yes," he leaned forward as though examining it. "He remarked on the craftsmanship." "And did you notice anything unusual about the platform or its surroundings?" The vicar thought carefully. "There was a faint sound like metal scraping wood just before he fell. I assumed it was a loose nail." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you both." She left no time for further conversation, knowing that initial impressions might carry clues masked by community politeness. As she crossed the village green, she reflected on the vicar's testimony. Templeton had a motive rooted in estate disputes, perhaps with Mrs. Cumberbatch, but why meet at the fair? And what of the scrap of paper with "cum"? Was it a fragment of her name or an attempt to implicate her? The baker's house lay next. Mrs. Price, voice weary from consoling her trembling daughter, greeted Miss Marple with a wave. "Thank you for inviting me in," Miss Marple said, joining them in the front parlor. "I wish to ask about Martha's glimpse at dawn." Mrs. Price hovered by her daughter, arms folded. "I told her not to speak of it, but I suppose it may be important." "Martha, dear," Miss Marple addressed the child gently, "you saw someone near the days after the doctor had gone?" The girl nodded, eyes wide. "It was someone tall, wearing a brown coat and hat. I thought it was the doctor at first, but then—" She shivered. "Not the doctor?" Martha shook her head. "Too tall. Dr. Lambert is short." Miss Marple then turned to Mrs. Price. "When did Dr. Lambert leave the scene?" Mrs. Price thought. "About half an hour before dawn. He said he had an emergency call to attend." "An emergency call?" Miss Marple's interest piqued. "Do you know where he went?" Mrs. Price bit her lip. "He returned to his home so swiftly, I could not see. But when he left the surgery at dawn, he looked exhausted." Miss Marple's mind raced. If neither the doctor nor Hayward nor Cumberbatch nor Partridge yet provided solid proof of murderous intent, the significance lay in the details of their comings and goings. She thanked the Price family and stepped back onto the street. Her next visit was to Mrs. Florence Cumberbatch's rented cottage at the edge of town. The house, once belonging to the local squire, creaked with disuse. Cumberbatch answered the door in a silk dressing gown, her eyes rimmed with sleepless worry. "Miss Marple," she greeted, voice guarded. "I trust you have news, only questions," Miss Marple replied, stepping inside. The house smelled faintly of cigar smoke and lavender. Portraits of a stately gentleman Cumberbatch's late husband hung in the hallway. You said you had no contact with Mr. Templeton before the fair? She smoothed her dressing gown. None. He concluded my late husband's will months ago. There were discrepancies in the accounts, which I have since settled with his firm based in the city. Miss Marple observed her carefully. Yet you arrived in Little Dismore only yesterday. Cumberbatch's lips pressed into a thin line. Circumstances demanded it. I wished to reclaim the doll's house before it left the village, as a family heirloom. She nodded. My mother's favorite miniature. She kept it in pride of place in our drawing room. Did you truly believe it was sold at auction? I was told the church needed funds, Cumberbatch said. I had hoped the proceeds would go toward restoration of the parish hall, as I requested. Miss Marple tapped her walking stick. Yet now you reside mere yards from it, and your name appears scrawled on a scrap of paper beneath the days. Cumberbatch paled. I have no idea how that note came to be. Did you or your solicitor leave such a note? She shook her head fiercely. Absolutely not. Miss Marple nodded. I see. She prepared to leave, but paused. Mrs. Cumberbatch, where were you when Mr. Templeton died? I was in my car, speaking with my driver. I did not attend the fair, and can anyone corroborate that? Cumberbatch hesitated. My driver. Miss Marple inclined her head. Thank you. I shall speak with him. She turned and left, her mind tracing ever more tangled threads. Her final stop was to visit Dr. George Lambert at his surgery. Though she had been there once, she felt compelled to learn more about the mysterious emergency call mentioned by Mrs. Price. Dr. Lambert sat behind his desk, ringed by medical books, looking wearier than ever. Miss Marple, he said, reaching for a glass of water. You look troubled. I wondered about your emergency call, she said. Mrs. Price mentioned you left quickly before dawn. He sighed and rubbed his temples. Yes, a patient in the north end of the village. Young Mrs. Aldridge went into labor unexpectedly. I had to attend her bedside. Miss Marple noted this, a legitimate, urgent duty. And did you return to the fair afterward? He looked pained. I left after dawn broke. By then, the body had been removed, and I frankly felt I was not much use there. She accepted this. Her attention turned to a photograph on his desk, the Aldridges' new parents, gazing lovingly at their infant. The doctor's solemn face softened. I trust they are well, he nodded. Both mother and child are healthy. Miss Marple closed her notebook. You truly found no sign of foul play in Mr. Templeton's death? He leaned back. I wish I had, so that I might have chased down the culprit. But no nature had its own design. I am sorry. She gave him a small bow. Thank you, doctor. As she stepped back into the morning light, Miss Marple reflected on her inquiries. Hayward's mechanical interest was innocent yet obsessive. Partridge's missing tools remained unaccounted for. Mrs. Cumberbatch harbored resentments tied to wills and estates, and Dr. Lambert's alibi, though solid, revealed where he had not been during critical moments. Constable Finch, as yet unvisited, remained a final piece. Returning home for a light luncheon, Miss Marple paused at her gate, watching smoke curl from chimneys and children play in hedgerow ditches. The village, to the casual observer, was a serene picture of pastoral innocence. Yet within each house lurked secret small betrayals, unspoken fears, grudges nurtured over decades. She settled by her window with a plate of cucumber sandwiches and a pot of tea. As she quietly consumed her meal, she laid out the events on her lap, mapping times and places. Templeton's collapsed 2 paces from the days. Leaning toward the doll's house, a scrap of paper bearing "Come" lay beneath the platform. A faint scrape at dawn suggested someone jiggled the clasp. Partridge's tweezers vanished. Hayward's mechanical curiosity placed him at the days twice. Mrs. Cumberbatch's estate matters gave her motive. Dr. Lambert's call took him away before dawn's light. Finch measured but offered no clear insight into motive. She sipped. her tea and glanced at her knitting. The pattern lay neat and even, each stitch a testament to order. Yet the mystery before her was anything but. Among these suspects, one would emerge as the culprit, yet perhaps all bore threads of complicity. She reflected on human nature, how a slight hurt could fester, how ambition or resentment could fester into malice. The afternoon sun dipped low, and Miss Marple, rising with a quiet resolve, donned her shawl. It was time to walk the village lanes again and pay another call, this time to Constable Finch, whose reticence had intrigued her nearly as much as any confession. She stepped out, knitting nestled in her pocket, and set off with the patient calm of one who knew that in the game of secrets, even the smallest piece revealed the whole. In Little Dismore, the first suspects had been named, but the true culprit still lay hidden, waiting for the subtle telescope of Miss Marple's observation to bring them into focus. Chapter 5. A hidden clue. Miss Marple awoke to the hush before dawn, when Little Dismore's narrow lanes lay empty, and soft light filtered through gauzy curtains. Her mind stirred with last night's reflections, the tangled motives, the half-glimpsed movements, the faint smear of rust that was too tidy to be mere coincidence. Wrapping a woolen shawl about her shoulders, she stepped outside, knitting needles tucked into her pocket, and set off toward the village constable's house on Honeywood Lane. Constable Harold Finch lived in a modest brick cottage with climbing wisteria framing the windows. As Miss Marple approached, she saw his lantern shining through the glass, and the dull thud of footsteps echoed in the hall. She rapped lightly on the carved oak door. "Come in," Finch called, voice cautious yet weary. Inside, he stood by a small desk, strewn with maps of the vicarage grounds and scribbled notes. A half-drunk mug of tea sat cooling on a coaster. Finch looked up, pale and drawn. "Miss Marple," he said, smoothing his collar. "I didn't expect you so early." "Good morning, Harold," she replied, seating herself on a straight-backed chair. "I wondered if you might indulge me once more." He cleared a space on the desk. "Of course." Miss Marple inclined her head. "You mentioned yesterday that you heard a faint scrape when Mr. Templeton collapsed. Have you been able to determine its source?" Finch exhaled. "I thought it was the nail on the day's rusted, perhaps catching the wood. But I found something odd last night." He opened a drawer and withdrew a small, folded scrap of brown paper. "It was tucked behind these maps when I returned to collect my notes. I didn't place it there." Miss Marple accepted the scrap. On it was scrawled, in hurried ink, the fragment. "DOLL." She held it up. "Dollhouse?" Finch nodded. "I thought the same. I've not shown it to anyone else. Thought you should see it first." Miss Marple studied the script. The letters were spidery, uneven, likely written in haste or under duress. She refolded the scrap and slipped it into her pocket. "Thank you, Harold. You have done well to keep this safe." He looked relieved. "I want to help, Miss Marple, but every time I think I have a handle on it, another question arises." She smiled kindly. "That is the nature of a mystery, my dear. A tangled web, each strand needing careful disentanglement." Finch brightened. "Yes, exactly. You always put things so plainly." Miss Marple rose. "One more favor, Harold. Might I retrieve the soil sample you took from beneath the days?" He hesitated. "I gave it to Dr. Lambert for analysis." "Ah," she said softly. "Then I must pay him another visit." Leaving Finch to his papers, Miss Marple walked the dew-damp path back toward Church Street. She paused at the corner where Martha Price often played, recalling the child's frightened description of a figure in early light. The investigation wove from Partridge's missing tweezers to Hayward's mechanical fascination, to Cumberbatch's scrawled fragment of identity, and now this fresh scrap, hinting at the doll's house itself. Her next stop was Dr. Lambert's surgery, where the walls were lined with certificates and medical tomes. The doctor received her with a tentative smile. "Back again, Miss Marple?" he asked. I trust you have not fallen prey to the chill. I seek the soil sample taken from the days," she said, "and any analysis you might have." He fetched a small vial and a slip of paper. There were traces of iron oxide, nothing unexpected from weathered nails. But I also noted an unusual fibrous fragment entwined in the soil. I thought you might wish to examine it yourself. He handed her a tiny glass slide encased in paper. On it, a single strand of coarse fabric, twisted and frayed. Miss Marple peered through her spectacles. The thread was a deep burgundy, the weave unfamiliar. She tapped the edge of the slide gently. "Thank you, doctor. This may prove significant." She tucked both the scrap of paper and the fabric slide into her reticule and stepped back into the early light. The village was awakening. The baker's windows gleamed with fresh loaves, and the churchyard gate creaked as a gardener arrived. Yet behind every door lay secret histories, and Miss Marple felt she was drawing closer to an understanding. Mid-morning found her at the Crown and Thistle, where the fitful clink of china accompanied subdued conversation. She ordered a pot of strong tea and sat near the fireplace, unfolding her notes. The burgundy thread and the doll scrap suggested someone intentionally guided suspicion back to the doll's house. But who stood to gain from such misdirection? Her attention shifted to the door, through which Mrs. Winifred Potts, the council clerk, entered with purposeful stride. Mrs. Potts paused when she saw Miss Marple. Drawn by the old lady's reputation for insight, "Miss Partridge has requested your presence," she said. She found something else in her cottage, with a nod. Miss Marple followed Mrs. Potts back to the governess's home. The cottage door stood open as if in welcome, though inside, Miss Partridge's composure wavered. She met Miss Marple in the parlor, where the doll's house sat on a table draped with a white cloth. "Thank you for coming," Partridge said, motioning for them to sit. "I found this under my workbench." She handed Miss Marple a small, tarnished key attached to a length of burgundy ribbon. Miss Marple turned it over. It bore the inscription EMP in delicate script. The ribbon's color matched the fragment of fabric from the day's soil. "My mother used this key to wind the miniature music box, hidden in the third floor of the doll's house," Partridge explained, voice trembling. "After the incident, I searched the cottage and discovered it missing from its place on my dressing table." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. The key's initials ZMP matched Elizabeth Mary Partridge, Partridge's full name, known to all. Yet why had the key been dropped beneath her workbench? And who had tied it to burgundy ribbon, then discarded it? "Do you recall when you last saw it?" Miss Marple asked. Partridge clasped her hands. "I wound the music box on Tuesday evening to test its mechanism. It played a soft lullaby, my mother's favorite. Then I returned the key to my dressing table. I locked the drawers when I left on Thursday morning." Intending to auction the doll's house the next day, Miss Marple examined the key. The bit was slightly bent, as though forced into a lock not its own. She slipped on a pair of thin gloves, took out her knitting needle, and carefully probed the wards. "There's resistance here," as though the key was turned in a similar but different lock. Partridge's breath caught. "You mean someone tried to open something else with it?" "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Possibly the clasp of the doll's house itself." She rose and moved to the table. On the cloth beneath the house lay no visible marks, but Miss Marple placed the key at the back, aligning the bit with the clasp. Gently, she turned it once, twice. The flimsy metal groaned faintly, but it turned enough to loosen the clasp. The red door popped open with a soft click. Inside, the miniature parlor revealed its usual furnishings, tiny chairs, a rug, and a silver patinade music box. But Miss Marple's eyes fell on a slender object tucked behind the music box, a tiny dagger. Its blade no longer than a child's finger, sharpened and gleaming with dried rust. Partridge gasped. "The dagger! I thought it lost forever." Miss Marple carefully lifted it by the pommel, avoiding the blade. The rust matched the smear on the days. The burgundy ribbon was threaded through the handle's ring. So, Miss Marple mused. Someone removed the dagger from the doll's house clasp, wore the ribbon perhaps to conceal it, and then discarded both when their plan went awry. Partridge surged to her feet. But why? It is merely a family curiosity. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. A family curiosity, yes, but also a weapon. And its disappearance coincides with Mr. Templeton's death. Mrs. Potts, who had remained silent, stepped forward. Could someone have intended to use it, or to frighten someone into silence? Miss Marple replaced the dagger in its hiding place and closed the door. Either is possible. The question is, who had the opportunity to remove it, and who had motive to wield it if only to threaten? Partridge covered her mouth. But anyone could have taken the key, Miss Cumberbatch, Mr. Hayward, even the doctor while I was tending to the raffle or in conversation. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Yet the burgundy ribbon suggests a personal touch. Who among our suspects favors such a color? Who might have had access to your drawers? Partridge shuddered. I wish I knew. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You have been most helpful. Keep the key and dagger safe, and say nothing of our discovery until I have asked one more question. They left the cottage in a thoughtful silence. Outside, the day had brightened, but the hidden clue lay heavy between them. Miss Marple's mind raced. The scrap of paper, doll, the burgundy fabric in the soil, the key marked EMP. The tiny dagger all pointed to a plot woven around the doll's house itself. Yet the would-be assassin had bungled, leaving behind evidence that implicated the owner's heirloom rather than the true culprit. Seeking fresh air, Miss Marple retraced her steps along the old mill stream, the water murmuring over stones as swallows darted overhead. It was there she paused, recalling a detail from Mrs. Potts's notebook, a mention of Turton and Gables, the city firm that had handled Cumberbatch's estate matters. If the cutter of the dagger had intended to frighten Mrs. Cumberbatch or someone else, they might have left that initial scrap come to implicate her. But why frame her for a murder weapon's disappearance? She slipped the key from her pocket and examined the initials once more. EMP Elizabeth Mary Partridge. Had the dagger's removal been revenge against Partridge for some long-forgotten grievance? Or had someone taken advantage of her workshop to hide the weapon, only for it to be discovered in panic? Her feet carried her unbidden to the village post office, where Miss Potts was compiling letters by the lantern's glow. She greeted them both with a nod. I have a question, said Miss Marple quietly. A letter arrived from Mr. Templeton on Wednesday last, sealed, bearing no return address. Might you recall its appearance? Potts pursed her lips. Yes, a heavy cream envelope, thick paper, with the single word confidential stamped in blood-red ink. The contents were brief, nothing but a typed note requesting a meeting at the fair. Miss Marple's breath caught. And you have a copy? Potts retrieved a file and handed Miss Marple the original envelope and its folded note. The note read, Meet me by the Georgian doll's house at the auction. I have information that cannot wait. Alone. E.M. Miss Marple studied the signature. E.M. Could that be Elizabeth Mary Partridge herself? Or another E.M. Eleanor Mary Cumberbatch? Or even Edward Miles Hayward? She refolded the note and placed it alongside the burgundy ribbon and the scrap, DOLL, in her reticule. The pieces glimmered there, initials reversed, fragments calling to each other across spaces of doubt. Miss Marple emerged into the crisp afternoon, the weight of the hidden clue pressing on her. The confrontation was drawing near. Secrets would spill, alliances would shatter, and the true nature of the murder plot rooted in that delicate Georgian doll's house would at last come into sight. But until then, she would carry these fragments like keys, unlocking the hidden doors of human deceit one by one. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. Miss Marple. felt the weight of the afternoon sun press gently against her shoulders as she made her way toward the Crown and Thistle to convene with Mrs. Winifred Potts. The village clerk had suggested that there might be merit in gathering those closest to the case under a single roof, if only to observe how the various threads of motive and opportunity might twist around one another. When strained together, Miss Partridge, Lawrence Hayward, Mrs. Cumberbatch, and Dr. Lambert would each be present, though Miss Marple made no announcement of the purpose. She preferred subtlety to spectacle. By 3 o'clock, the rear parlor of the pub had been reserved under the pretense of a private committee meeting for the upcoming harvest festival. A long table was cleared and polished, and an extra chair placed at its head. Miss Marple arrived first, followed by Miss Partridge, whose anxiety was betrayed by the way she folded and refolded the skirt of her afternoon dress. Lawrence Hayward slipped in next, his pale countenance betraying fatigue, but his posture composed. Mrs. Cumberbatch swept in behind him, trailing the faintest hint of lavender, her eyes darting over the group until they settled on Miss Marple. Finally, Dr. George Lambert entered, removing his cap with polite restraint. Mrs. Potts appeared last, carrying a ledger and a stack of envelopes. "Thank you all for coming," she announced in her crisp, efficient tone. "I trust you saw my notice pinned at the post office." She placed the envelopes in the center of the table. "I suggested we meet to discuss the state of the parish hall restoration, however. We have an urgent matter to address first." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you, Mrs. Potts. Your hospitality is appreciated." She took a seat, meeting each suspect's gaze in turn. "I believe it may be beneficial if we speak frankly if there is something troubling any of us. It will serve the truth best if spoken aloud." She paused. "Shall we begin with Miss Partridge?" Miss Partridge drew a shuddering breath. "Me, of course." She forced a small smile. I confess that when I realized the dagger had been removed from the doll's house, I felt not only fear but betrayal. It was my family's heirloom, meant to be kept safe, not used as a weapon. Hayward leaned forward. "But Mrs. Partridge, if someone intended to harm Mr. Templeton with it, they would hardly use a weapon that belonged to you. It would point suspicion at you rather than at themselves." Her eyes glistened. "Yes, and yet they did both use the dagger and planted fragments of paper to suggest my complicity." She tapped her fingers on the table. "I cannot believe any of you would do such a thing, but the knowledge that someone did so terrifies me." Mrs. Cumberbatch spoke quietly from the far side of the table. "I had no reason to harm Mr. Templeton or to frame Miss Partridge." Her voice wavered. "He was my solicitor, yes, but we parted on civil terms." "But you did dispute the will your late husband left you," Miss Marple interjected, "and that dispute was ongoing until just before the fair." Cumberbatch's lashes fluttered. "That is true. I suspected the trust fund had been mismanaged. I wrote to his firm city solicitors several times. When the replies seemed evasive, I came here to settle matters in person." She folded her hands. "But I would not harm the man who once drew the final line under my husband's will." Dr. Lambert cleared his throat. "Mistakes happen in paperwork, but murder is hardly an accident." His gaze was direct. "If we are to clear the air, might we address the letters signed E.M. that arrived for Mr. Templeton?" Mrs. Potts bowed her head, picking up one envelope. This was the final correspondence. She passed the note to Miss Marple, who laid it gently on the table, alongside the DOLL scrap and the burgundy ribbon. The envelope bore no return address, merely the stamp "Confidential." She tapped the paper, and the initials matched those of two present: Elizabeth Mary Partridge or Eleanor Mary Cumberbatch. Partridge flinched. Cumberbatch's knuckles whitened around her teacup. Hayward's eyebrows raised in mild surprise. Dr. Lambert remained impassive, though Miss Marple had learned to recognize the faint lift of his lips when he was uneasy. Mrs. Cumberbatch spoke first. I never signed anything in correspondence with him. My communications were through my city firm, Turton and Gables, and were formal letters, not cryptic requests for a midnight meeting. Partridge shook her head slowly. Nor did I until I saw that note. I had forgotten the little initials on my music box key. But I assure you, I did not send Mr. Templeton an invitation. Hayward cleared his throat. Nor I days before the fair. I was occupied with repairs to my automaton, which required my full attention. I have letters to that effect. Dr. Lambert's voice was clear. I was on call at the Aldridge home, preparing for the birth. My alibi is medical records. He tapped the ledger before him. I confess none of this absolves the letter writer, but it narrows the circle. Miss Marple let a moment pass in silence, observing each face. Then she said, I have another question for you, Mr. Hayward. Yesterday, you mentioned hearing voices by the days in the pre-dawn light. He nodded. Yes, I heard Mrs. Cumberbatch's name mentioned. Precisely, Miss Marple said. Yet you did not report the content, only that you feared eavesdropping. Why? His jaw tightened. Because the voices belonged to Mrs. Cumberbatch's driver and a representative from Turton and Gables. They were discussing the will. How Mrs. Cumberbatch wished to secure the heirloom doll's house for herself. He ran a hand through his hair. I feared it was none of my business. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Cumberbatch. Your driver, Mr. Stevens, and the solicitor's representative, were they here at dawn? Cumberbatch looked down. Yes, I arranged to meet him before the auction began to finalize payment for the house's return. My driver waited in the lane. Dr. Lambert frowned. So you had reason to be at the days before the auction and someone saw you. Cumberbatch's voice trembled. I have no memory of his death. I arrived moments after to collect the house. I found Mr. Templeton. Collapsed, she brushed away a tear. I would never harm him. Miss Marple's gaze held hers. I know. Yet someone moved among us with ill intent, and that person used your plans as cover. Mrs. Potts laid down the ledger and sighed. Why not speak of these meetings earlier? It might have saved confusion. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Some matters we keep private, Mrs. Potts, until the need for disclosure is clear. Now, I wish to address the matter of the burgundy ribbon and the fabric fragment. She produced the glass slide. This thread was found in the soil beneath the days. It matches the ribbon tied to the dagger. She placed the slide before them. Who among you possesses garments or ribbons of this color? Cumberbatch's face went gray. I have a burgundy velvet shawl that belonged to Mrs. Templeton's cousin. She looked at Partridge. Though I swear I never wore it here. Partridge shook her head. I have nothing of that shade. My wardrobe is lavender and steel blue. Hayward glanced at his lapel. My waistcoat is dark green. No burgundy that I recall. Dr. Lambert frowned. My medical gown is plain white. I don't see how that implicates me. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. Yet someone used that ribbon deliberately. The question is not who owns the ribbon, but who had access to it. Her gaze drifted to Lawrence Hayward. Mr. Hayward, I believe you commented yesterday that you admired Miss Partridge's rose pattern curtains and her ribbons. You asked where she purchased them. He swallowed. I did because I have a penchant for interior fabrics, but I never handled them. Miss Marple rested her hands on the table. And yet, last night, the crimson threads were discovered beneath the days, entwined in the soil. One might suppose someone took the ribbon from Mrs. Partridge's workshop. Partridge's breath caught. My ribbons. Someone must have rifled through my things when I was distracted. She pressed her hand to her heart. But I would never use them for a weapon. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. But to frame another is a cunning misdirection. One might take the ribbon of a governess to suggest her guilt, while the true culprit hides beneath a cloak of concern. A tense silence settled. Mrs. Cumberbatch exhaled sharply. You think there is a murderer among us who is manipulating evidence, one who knows us all well. Miss Marple inclined her head. Exactly so. And I believe that person has played us like instruments, each clue a note in a symphony of deception. Dr. Lambert's voice was low. Then the next step is to unmask the conductor. Miss Marple's eyes shone. Yes, but before we proceed, there is one more secret to surface. She reached into her reticule and withdrew the small silver music box key. Ribbon removed, bearing the initials EMP. Everyone leaned in. This key unlocked the music box within the doll's house. It was missing, only to be found cast aside beneath Mrs. Partridge's bench. She replaced it gently on the table. The dagger was removed with it. Someone planned to use that weapon or to suggest that Mrs. Partridge had done so. Hayward's face paled. But why choose that dagger? It would draw suspicion to an innocent party. Because, Miss Marple said, the true murderer delights in hiding in plain sight. They wish us to hunt for motive in the obvious place while they remain concealed. Mrs. Potts cleared her throat. Miss Marple, if one of us is the culprit, might we ask if anyone here has unexplained absences or unaccounted for time slots? She looked each in the eye. Partridge's hands trembled. Hayward's foot tapped. Cumberbatch's face was set in a fragile mask of composure. Dr. Lambert's posture stiffened. Finch's earlier insight came to her mind, a figure seen crouching by the days. That figure was tall, wearing a brown coat and had Hayward's attire. He had motive to protect his knowledge of mechanical curio, but no clear reason for murder. Cumberbatch had means and motive concerning the will, but little opportunity. Partridge had the key but no wish to kill. The doctor had the least connection to the heirloom. And Mrs. Potts, it occurred to Miss Marple, had orchestrated this gathering and held the ledger of everyone's comings and goings. She fixed her gaze on Mrs. Potts. Mrs. Potts, you suggested this meeting and compiled our statements. How did you learn of the scrap doll and the note signed E.M.? Potts's brow furrowed. I found the fragment in the archive folder for last year's Harvest Festival. It was wedged between minutes from a council meeting along with the other correspondence. Delivered to the post office, Miss Marple pressed gently. Whose desk is that folder kept on? Potts looked uncomfortable. My desk, of course, and yet you did not mention it until now. I did not think it significant until Miss Marple presented the evidence, Potts admitted. She glanced at the scrap and then at the faces gathered. I only wished to see the restoration proceed. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Potts. No one doubts your intentions. She turned back to the group. We have each disclosed much, yet one heart remains closed, a heart that bears the weight of guilt. I believe the next step is to observe where these pieces note, ribbon, key, dagger align most closely with motive and opportunity. Silence reigned as each person absorbed her words. Miss Marple rose. Thank you for your candor. I think we have concessions enough for one sitting. Let us reconvene after you have had time to reflect. In the meantime, I shall continue my inquiries. They rose as well, exchanging uncertain glances. Mrs. Potts lingered to help Miss Partridge gather her scattered sewing notions. Hayward and Cumberbatch departed side by side, their quiet conversation laden with unspoken tension, and Dr. Lambert offered Miss Marple a curt nod before following them into the corridor. As the parlor emptied, Miss Marple remained at the head of the table, gazing down at the artifacts arrayed like puzzle pieces. The air was thick with unspoken truths, and she sensed that the next confrontations would reveal more than mere secrets. They would expose the raw motives that had turned a peaceful village fete into the stage for a deadly intrigue. She gathered her reticule and stepped into the fading light, resolved that the true culprit's mask would soon slip, undone by the very closeness of their confidence and the unerring precision of her quiet observations. In Little Dismore, where secrets had once been buried beneath polite smiles and trimmed hedges, Miss Marple knew the final act of this drama was fast approaching, and that no one present would leave the final confrontation unchanged. Chapter 7. Another twist. Morning after the gathering at the Crown and Thistle dawned cool and mist-shrouded, as though the village itself hesitated to emerge from its uneasy slumber. Miss Marple stood at her gate, gazing across the dew-laced lawn, her shawl wrapped tightly against the chill. In the distance, a church bell tolled gently, yet its familiar peal sounded hollow in her ears. Secrets lay buried beneath every hedge and behind each prim door. She knew that by the time the sun climbed above the rooftops, another revelation would shift the path of her investigation. She made her way first to the old mill stream, where the water murmured over worn stones and the reeds swayed in ghostly half-light. Here she often found solitude and clarity. Drawing a deep breath, she walked the narrow path as memories of the previous day's confrontations drifted through her mind. The magnetic tug of motive and opportunity, Hayward's mechanical enthusiasm, Cumberbatch's will disputes, Partridge's missing heirloom, Lambert's medical alibi. Potts's role in collating evidence had entangled her thoughts, but something about Mrs. Potts's careful orchestration of the meeting nagged at her. Was it simple civic duty or a deeper manipulation? A sudden rustle in the reeds startled her. She peered through her spectacles and saw a glint of light. Bending carefully, she discovered a small scrap of heavy parchment, mottled with damp. The letters E.L. were faintly inked across its surface. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. E.L. Eleanor Lidicott? Or Edward Lambert? She murmured. The initials did not match any signature yet found, but the location, the stream that ran behind the vicarage, spoke volumes. Someone had disposed of this note deliberately, believing it would be lost to the current. Yet Miss Marple's keen eye had found it. She folded the scrap into her pocket and carried on toward the vicarage. The churchyard was silent, save for the mournful cawing of a solitary crow. Reverend Pritchard stood by the light gate, his face drawn with concern. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, voice low. "I trust your walk was uneventful?" She held out the parchment. "I found this near the stream. Do you recognize the handwriting?" He took the scrap and studied it. "It does resemble the clerk's script, Mrs. Potts's, but I cannot be certain." He handed it back. "She uses various inks for her minutes. But why would someone discard such a note here?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because they wished to implicate else, then remove evidence of their own hand." The stream was a convenient purifier. The vicar's eyes widened. "You think Mrs. Potts planted this, or someone tried to frame her?" "It is one of our possibilities," she said, "but I shall confirm it soon enough." She thanked him and continued on. Her next call was the Crown and Thistle, drawn by the promise of fresh news. The landlord greeted her with an anxious nod. "Miss Marple," he said, "Dr. Lambert called earlier. He wished to speak with you urgently." Intrigued, Miss Marple took his arm and followed him to the consultation room, usually reserved for private nursing duties. There, Dr. Lambert stood by a small writing desk, his usual composure shaken. "Miss Marple," he greeted, "forgive me for intruding again, but I have discovered something significant." He held up a glass vial containing a single thread of burgundy. "This fell from Mrs. Cumberbatch's cloak when she came to see me after the fair. I examined it under my microscope, and it matches precisely the thread you found beneath the days." Miss Marple's lips curved, which confirms that the burgundy fabric was not limited to Mrs. Partridge's ribbons. Mrs. Cumberbatch's cloak or shawl was the source. Lambert nodded. "She arrived here claiming illness, nerves," she said, "yet I found no sign of fever or distress. However, I noted the hem of her garment was frayed, the burgundy threads loose." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "So the ribbon used to bind the dagger could have been cut from her own cloak." The doctor sank into a chair. "Yet she insists she never wore it near the days. I find her testimony unconvincing." Miss Marple accepted the file. "Thank you. This places Mrs. Cumberbatch at the scene, but not necessarily as the murderer. It does, however, give her both motive and means." He looked relieved. "That is what I feared. I trust you will take caution." She tucked the file into her reticule. "Thank you, Doctor. Your diligence is invaluable." Emerging into the afternoon, Miss Marple considered her next move. The tension had shifted. No longer did the dagger implicate Partridge's workshop so strongly. Instead, a new trail led to the elegant widow who had drawn her cloak tightly around her shoulders. Yet Miss Marple also recalled the vicar's mention of E.L. and the scrap near the stream. She decided to pay one more visit, this time to Mrs. Winifred Potts at the parish office. The little brick building was locked, but a note on the door invited her to find Mrs. Potts at the village hall, where preparations for the harvest festival were underway. Inside the hall, long tables were set for the evening feast, and volunteers were busy stringing lanterns. Mrs. Potts, clipboard in hand, directed a group of seamstresses. Upon seeing Miss Marple, she excused herself and hurried over, her cheeks flushed. "Miss Marple," she said, breathless, "thank goodness you're here. I just received a letter." She handed Miss Marple a cream envelope, similar to the one delivered to Mr. Templeton. The envelope bore the same confidential stamp, but this time the initials were typed. E.C. Miss Marple's forehead creased. "E.C. Eleanor Cumberbatch?" Potts nodded, wringing her hands. "Yes, I opened it. It says simply, 'Stop digging in the past, or more will be revealed.' That was all." Miss Marple unfolded the note. The script was neat, formal, unlike the hasty EM or the spidery EL. Potts looked around at the volunteers, their heads bent over decorations. "I didn't know what to do." Miss Marple slipped the new note into her reticule. "You were right to shelter it. This is another warning, one meant to intimidate." She paused, studying Potts's face. "Did you confide in anyone about the notes you found or the scrap of paper?" Potts hesitated. "I told no one, but you and the vicar." Miss Marple nodded. The multiple sets of initials EMEL. EC spoke of different authors or forged signatures intended to confuse, yet the lace between them was fine, each related to a motive rooted in past entanglements and brewing resentments. "Thank you, Mrs. Potts," Miss Marple said. "You have served this village well." Leaving the hall, Miss Marple paused beneath a budding oak. Her mind worked steadily. The burgundy thread pointed to Eleanor Cumberbatch. The file confirmed her cloak had shed it. The warning note signed EC showed she wished to quell further probing. The scrap EL by the stream could implicate Dr. Lambert George's middle name was Edward Lawrence or Lawrence Hayward, if his full name bore those initials, and the dagger's original disappearance still linked back to Partridge's key. A sudden idea struck her. The Harvest Festival Guard, young men assigned to light the lanterns, would know who had ammunition to patrol the vicarage grounds at night. If she could find who carried a taper or a lantern near the days late at night, she might catch someone in the lie. She returned to the vicarage and found Constable Finch on his white horse, preparing for the festival procession. "Good afternoon, Harold," she called. He slid from the saddle. "Miss Marple, good to see you. What brings you here? I wonder if you recall, who among our lantern bearers was assigned to the north side of the lawn closest to the stream late last night?" Finch frowned. "I thought it was Mr. Giles, the blacksmith's apprentice. He's tall and strong, and he lit that corner after the mayor's speech." Miss Marple pressed gently. "Did you see him again afterward?" He hesitated. "No," he finished, and went to help with the harvest tables. "But he lingered longer near the days than the others." "Thank you," she said. "That is quite helpful." She mounted her bicycle by the sundial and pedaled to the blacksmith's forge. There she found young Giles Shoemaker, arms strong as iron, face streaked with sweat and soot. "Mr. Shoemaker," she greeted. "A word?" He set aside his hammer. "Miss Marple, what can I do for you?" I understand you bore a lantern near the vicarage lawn last night. He nodded, wiping his brow. Aye, ma'am. I was on duty for the procession, and afterward, you stayed near the days longer than the rest. He swallowed. I saw someone there. I thought it was Mrs. Cumberbatch coming to speak with the doctor. Describe what you saw. His dark eyes searched her face. It was late dusk. I heard a soft clink, like metal on wood. Then I saw a tall figure lean into the doll's house, ribbon on their coat catching the lamp's glow. I thought, someone's fiddling with that thing again. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The cloak, was it burgundy? Giles nodded. Yes, ma'am. Burgundy, with gold trim. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. And after that, you saw no one? He shook his head. I left to hang a lantern over the cake stall. When I returned at nearly midnight to check the lights, the daze was empty. She offered him a coin. Thank you, Giles. You've been most helpful. Back on her bicycle, Miss Marple felt the final shard of the puzzle sliding into place. A tall figure in a burgundy cloak, manipulating a clasp and dagger at dusk. Whispers of warnings signed EC. Scraps of paper EM and EL. Each twist pointed to Eleanor Cumberbatch as the most likely orchestrator of deception. Yet Miss Marple paused. Could the true murderer be framing Cumberbatch now, using her cloak and initials as a red herring? By the time she returned home, the sun had dipped low, painting the western sky in bruised purples. The final confrontation drew near, but in this new twist, Miss Marple recognized the heart of trickery. The next morning, she would call all suspects to the vicarage once more, this time not under the guise of committees or festivals, but to reveal the killer whose web of misdirection had ensnared them all. And as she settled by the hearth with her knitting, the air humming with unspoken tension, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. In Little Dismore, where every detail mattered, another twist had unveiled the deeper currents of motive, and soon, the true face behind the murders would stand exposed at last. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test. Miss Marple's invitation bore no hint of the storm to come. 3 days after the puzzling dispatch to the Harvest Festival Hall, she asked each of her acquaintances to join her for tea in the vicarage drawing room, under the pretext of discussing the proposed restoration of the doll's house for the parish collection. For the sake of propriety, she included Miss Partridge, Lawrence Hayward, Mrs. Cumberbatch, Dr. Lambert, Mrs. Potts, and by special request Constable Finch, whose keen eye she valued. Each accepted with polite eagerness, unaware that their every gesture would be under the gentle scrutiny of the sharpest observer in Little Dismore. The vicarage stood tranquil in the late morning light, its wisteria swathed fouade an emblem of village grace. Inside, the drawing room was arranged with Miss Marple's customary attention to detail. A neat tea tray on the side table, an array of delicate china, and cushions fluffed just so upon the settee. But at the center of the low mahogany table, under a glass dome, rested the doll's house itself, its little red door now secured by its restored clasp, beside which lay the tiny dagger, a folded key, and the burgundy ribbon, each artifact arranged like a beckoning clue. One by one, her guests arrived. Miss Partridge entered first, her face pale yet hopeful, clutching her reticule as though it held all her solace. Lawrence Hayward followed, his keen eyes briefly pausing at the glass dome, curiosity glinting in his gaze. Mrs. Cumberbatch swept in afterward, her finery muted in respect for the solemnity of the occasion, though her posture remained statuesque and her lips pressed in a thin line. Dr. Lambert appeared next, calm and professional, with Constable Finch behind him, his upright bearing betraying both eagerness and unease. Finally, Mrs. Potts arrived, her brow furrowed, ledger in hand, as though she intended to record every word spoken. Miss Marple greeted them at the door, her cardigan neat and her straw hat adorned with a single cornflower. She offered a gentle curtsy, "Thank you all for coming. Please do sit," she invited, indicating the ring of chairs around the table. "We have much to consider concerning the safekeeping of this remarkable heirloom." As the guests took their seats, Miss Marple poured tea with deliberate grace and filled each cup. The soft clink of porcelain seemed amplified in the hushed room. She seated herself at the head of the table and offered a small smile. "I trust you have all had the chance to examine our little friend here. She needs a suitable home, and I thought it fitting we discuss her future." Mrs. Potts cleared her throat. "Indeed, I have drawn up proposals for the hall display, but perhaps we should first revisit the question of security, given recent events." Miss Marple inclined her head. "A prudent suggestion. Wells and displays can practice the utmost care, yet one must also guard against the intent to harm. Let us each handle these artifacts, if we may, and consider their significance." She turned to Miss Partridge. "My dear, would you be so kind as to present the clasp?" Miss Partridge approached timidly, her skirt swishing. With a gloved finger, she lifted the glass dome and retrieved the clasp. She turned it over in her hand, her gaze flicking to the dagger. "It is so small," she murmured, her voice soft, "and yet it nearly cost a life." A tremor ran through her fingers, and she set the clasp gently back under the glass. "Next, Lawrence Hayward rose. "Might I examine the mechanism?" he asked, his voice quiet but insistent. He carefully lifted the dome and picked up the key by its handle, letting the ribbon fall between his fingers. His eyes brightened as he inspected the bit. "Fascinating," he said. "Notice the slight crackler in the metal. It suggests sustained tension, as though turned repeatedly in haste." Mrs. Cumberbatch stiffened. "Haste," she repeated. "Yes, but perhaps that haste saved a life." She leaned forward, adjusting her shawl. "May I? I would prefer to see how the dagger fits the clasp." Hayward passed the key to her, and she closed her gloved hand around it. As she fitted it to the clasp, her knuckles tightened. The key slipped into the wards and turned with a delicate click. The red door popped open, revealing the tiny dagger. Mrs. Cumberbatch's breath caught. She loosened her grip and allowed the dagger to clatter against the glass base. "It seems far too sharp," she said, her voice brittle. She replaced the dagger and snapped the door closed, her expression guarded. "I trust no one will misuse such an object again." Dr. Lambert rose, smoothing back his hair. "Forgive my intrusion, but I should like to satisfy my own curiosity." He took the dagger with a steady hand and held it by the pommel, blade down. His medical calm shone through as he traced the dried rust. Old iron oxidizes in humidity, yet the blade's edge is untouched, no sign of blood. Whoever handled it did so with care or with intent not to maim it deeply. He placed it back, pensive, a curious thought. Constable Finch, who had been silently observing each interaction, finally spoke. "May I see the ribbon once more?" He picked up the burgundy ribbon by its loose end, letting the loop dangle. "It is robust, meant to hold things fast. Yet these threads are frayed, as though cut." He leaned closer, peering at the ends. "I noted stitches from a cloak hem when I took the sample." A cloak, perhaps, like Mrs. Cumberbatch's. Mrs. Cumberbatch's lip twitched, but she said nothing. Finch laid the ribbon down with care. Mrs. Potts, ledger open on her lap, raised her eyes. "All fascinating details, but what of motive? We have examined means and opportunity. Perhaps it is time to speak of reasons." She locked eyes with Miss Partridge. "Mrs. Partridge, you stated you were distraught at the dagger's disappearance, yet you left your workshop unattended during the fair. Did you not suspect someone might relieve you of your keys and tools?" Her tone was measured, but an edge of accusation tinged her words. Miss Partridge sat back, her face coloring. "I believed the setting secure. I never imagined," she faltered, pressing a hand to her chest. Miss Marple raised a slender finger. "Indeed, We all make assumptions about the safety of our own spaces. Yet the true test is to watch how each of us responds when confronted with what we most fear. She swept her gaze over the assembled group. I believe, dear friends, that we learn more in how people react to a simple invitation than in the mere statements of their innocence. Hayward's voice cut in softly. You refer to our reactions just now. Did you note any telling detail? He fixed his gaze on Mrs. Potts, who met it with an unsteady blink. Miss Marple's lips curved. Several. For instance, Mrs. Cumberbatch's admission that the dagger's edge had never been dulled suggests a person unwilling to harm even intentionally, yet she showed relief when it was replaced in the house. As though grateful it remained under lock and key, she turned to Dr. Lambert. Doctor, you observed the blade's condition clinically, without disdain or fear. That calm is commendable, but you discreetly traced the rust, as though gauging its threat. Dr. Lambert inclined his head. A physician must assess risk at a glance. And you, Mr. Hayward, Miss Marple continued. You examined the mechanism with genuine delight. Yet when the door popped open, you stepped back, a momentary hesitation that spoke not of fear, but of recognition. You knew what might lie inside. Hayward's gaze flickered. He adjusted his jacket, but said nothing. Miss Marple's eyes then rested on Constable Finch. And you, Harold, examined the ribbon calmly, but your focus on Mrs. Cumberbatch suggested that her earlier denials were not entirely convincing. Finch lowered his head and met Miss Marple's eyes. I may have allowed my suspicion to guide me. Double quotes Mrs. Potts, perched on the edge of her chair, cleared her throat. Miss Marple, may I speak? The old lady nodded. Of course. Potts folded her hands. I have kept records of every meeting, every note, every fragment I deemed relevant. I have tried to be impartial. And yet, she trailed off, glancing at the dagger under glass as though fearing its lure. Miss Marple leaned forward. And yet, Mrs. Potts, I saw you hesitate when the scrappy L was mentioned, although you recovered it from between the guild minutes, you said. Then, just now, you alone did not handle any item. Instead, you observed with an intensity that spoke of fear. Potts's eyes widened. I feared someone might harm it again and blame the wrong person, or harm the wrong person, Miss Marple said softly. She turned to Miss Partridge. And you, my dear, although this was your heirloom, you neither rushed to protect the dagger nor the key, but sat back with a pained expression, as though you had expected betrayal. Partridge shivered. I never knew whom to trust. Miss Marple folded her hands beneath her chin. This, then, is the final test. Who among us reacts to the threat of exposure rather than to the simple act of handling these objects? She paused, letting her question settle. We have all displayed curiosity, reluctance, and fear. But fear of what? Of discovery, of guilt, or of earthquake revelations that tear at the fabric of our self-image? A heavy silence fell. Each guest reflected on their momentary responses. Hayward's glance of recognition, Cumberbatch's half-repressed relief, Lambert's professional detachment, Finch's pointed suspicion, Partridge's hurt acceptance, Potts's vigilant observation. Miss Marple rose, steps measured. I thank you all for your candor. You may rest assured that the doll's house will be safe under our collective watch. Yet I believe the true guardian of its secrets has revealed herself or himself, through what she did not say, rather than what she did. In time, the evidence will speak, and the right person will step forward, without another word. She reclaimed her straw hat and reticule, inclining her head in farewell. One by one, the guests filed out of the drawing room, leaving Miss Marple alone with the glass-encased artifacts. She sat quietly for a moment, hands folded in her lap, knitting needles resting on her cushion. The test was complete, though each had motives. Only one had reacted with the sharpened edge of self-preservation, behaving not like an innocent guardian of the past, but like someone desperate to conceal a dot as the late afternoon sun filtered through lace curtains. Miss Marple rose and opened the dome. She lifted the dagger by its handle, then the key, then the ribbon. Each piece carried its story. She placed them together on the velvet-lined tray, and as she did, a thoughtful smile touched her lips. Tomorrow, she would call them all again to reveal not just the hidden dagger, but the hidden heart that wielded it. For in the quiet theater of Little Dismore, the final act was at hand, and the audience of villagers would soon witness the unveiling. That only Miss Marple could deliver. Chapter 9. The revelate that afternoon. A hush fell over Little Dismore. The vicarage lawn, freshly mown and strewn with rose petals from the evening's wreath-making, was ringed by folding chairs. On a low table at the center stood the doll's house, its glass dome removed, the dagger, key, and ribbon arrayed neatly upon a velvet cushion. At Miss Marple's invitation, all those involved in the investigation, Miss Partridge, Lawrence Hayward, Mrs. Cumberbatch, Dr. Lambert, Mrs. Potts, and Constable Finch assembled beneath the soft glow of lanterns strung from the oak boughs. Miss Marple stood before them in the gathering dusk. Her straw hat exchanged for a simple bonnet, her cardigan draped over her shoulders like a mantle of authority. She held in her hand a small leather-bound notebook and a folded scrap of parchment. The air was thick with anticipation. Even the cricket in the hedges seemed to pause in mid-chirp. "Thank you all for coming," she began in her gentle, unwavering voice. "We have gathered to lay bare the heart of this mystery. A man lost his life, albeit by natural causes, but the hand that wielded fear misplaced a dagger, in hopes of silencing him. Tonight we confront not merely the instrument of intimidation, but the mind that conceived it." She placed the notebook on the table and unfolded the scrap of parchment marked E.L. for all to see. The scrap was discovered near the stream, thought lost in the current. Its initials Z.L. have led us astray, suggesting a name not among us. Yet when one examines its handwriting, it matches in every curve the script in your personal correspondence, Mr. Hayward. She met Hayward's pale blue eyes. Those letters were penned by you in an attempt to divert suspicion toward absent fingers. Hayward's face blanched. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Miss Marple continued, turning to the ribbon and the file. "This burgundy thread, taken from Mrs. Cumberbatch's cloak, thank you. Dr. Lambert helped us trace the owner of the garment. Yet the ribbon was cut with fine scissors, such as those in Mrs. Partridge's workshop. Who among us last held those scissors? Who visited the governess under the pretense of discussing antiques?" Her gaze swept the circle until it rested again on Lawrence Hayward. "You, sir." Lawrence's hands trembled. I asked Miss Partridge about her ribbons. I admire fabrics, and I inquired." Miss Marple held up a slender finger. "A polite inquiry, perhaps. Yet you then returned at dawn, lurking by the days, concealed by the rose trellis. When you thought none would see you, a lone figure crouched, fiddling with the clasp of the doll's house." She gestured toward the house. "You bent that nail to loosen the clasp. You pried open the red door with the very key you filched from Mrs. Partridge's dressing table. You removed this dagger, intending perhaps to threaten or punish Mr. Templeton." She lifted the dagger by its pommel. "Not redolent of outright violence, no blood stains remain. Because Mr. Templeton's end was determined by nature, not your weapon. He collapsed of heart failure at the moment he discovered the blade's absence, perhaps prompted by the shock you intended. Yet you overestimated his fortitude. The fright itself proved fatal." Hayward sank into his chair, eyes fixed on the grass. Mrs. Cumberbatch's lips parted in a silent O. Miss Partridge covered her mouth with trembling hands. Dr. Lambert looked away, and Mrs. Potts scribbled a single word, "rest," in her ledger under her breath. Finch cleared his throat, regaining composure. Miss Marple set the dagger down and picked up the key. The small instrument, she fit it neatly into the clasp, was not meant for embellishment, but as your tool of intimidation. You wished to frighten Mr. Templeton into selling without auction, so that you might acquire his hidden mechanical treasures at a lower price. A rare automaton, you believed, resided within this house, crafted by a master you revere. Hayward groaned. Yes, I did. I could not bear the thought someone else would outbid me at auction. I thought if I frightened him, you thought to scare him, Miss Marple said. Yet fate intervened. She met his gaze again. You acted alone, manipulating evidence to draw suspicion elsewhere. E.M. to implicate Mrs. Partridge. E.C. to suggest Mrs. Cumberbatch. This E.L. to hint at Dr. Lambert Edward Lawrence. You told no one of your middle name, hoping it would go unnoticed. But I noticed. Miss Marple turned to the group. Our constable here observed your hesitations, your furtive steps by the days at dawn, and your refusal to own your presence until the evidence overwhelmed you. The scrap beneath the days, the faint smear of rust on the platform came from your dagger's blade. You planted it deliberately, hoping the doctor's report of iron oxide would seem natural. Silence reigned. Hayward's shoulders slumped. I am so sorry. I never meant to kill him to kill anyone. I only wished to secure the doll's house. Miss Marple's expression softened. Mr. Hayward, you intended merely to frighten. You did not anticipate that fear could kill as surely as a blade. She stepped to his side. The law will consider your intentions and the result, but the moral consequence stands. You brought terror to a peaceful gathering and cut short a life. She turned back to the others. Thank you for your patience. You have all endured suspicion but acted with integrity. Mrs. Partridge's workshop key was taken dishonestly but returned. Mrs. Cumberbatch's cloak was used against her, but bore no ill intent. Dr. Lambert served his patients. Mrs. Potts sought to preserve both order and evidence, and Constable Finch maintained his duty. Mrs. Cumberbatch spoke, voice quavering. I thank you, Miss Marple, for seeing the truth, and for reminding us how small secrets can have large consequences. Mrs. Partridge dabbed her eyes. I only wish I had been more vigilant. Dr. Lambert placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Finch moved to stand behind Hayward. Miss Marple gathered her possessions. Let us close this chapter. Constable Finch, I trust you will see that Mr. Hayward receives the care he needs until the magistrate's hearing. She nodded to Hayward. And you, my dear, may reflect on how easily one's passions can lead astray. Hayward looked up, relief and remorse mingling in his eyes. Thank you, Miss Marple. I am grateful for your mercy as much as your astuteness. Miss Marple inclined her head. Mercy, indeed, for a flawed soul. But let all here be reminded, a peaceful village depends on the strength of its kindness and the alertness of its eyes. They remained on the vicarage lawn until the lanterns flickered against the night sky. Miss Marple watched as Lawrence Hayward, under Finch's escort, passed through the garden gate toward the waiting constabulary. She felt the stirring of finality, the unraveling complete, the hidden heart revealed. As the guests drifted away, the doll's house stood quietly beneath the oak, its little red door locked once more. On the velvet cushion lay the dagger, key, and ribbon, silent witnesses to the power of human frailty. And Miss Marple, settling onto a wooden bench, considered the gentle hum of village life. Tomorrow, the parish would return to its routines, the festival preparations would resume, and the roses along Honeywood Lane would still bloom. Yet in the hush of the night, she whispered a prayer that little Dismore would remain vigilant, its watchful souls remembering that behind the prettiest fouade can lie the most dangerous impulse, and that in the smallest details, truth will always disclose itself. Chapter 10. Aftermath. Dawn. After the revelation broke over Little Dismore with a serene clarity that seemed almost at odds with the tumult of the previous days. The vicarage lawn, once the stage for both tragedy and intrigue, lay empty of chairs and clutter. The rose petals had been swept away, and the lanterns lowered for storage until the next festival. In their place, tables were arranged for the final day's celebrations, and bunting was hoisted again, its colors bright against the pale spring sky. Miss Marple stood at her gate, knitting in hand, observing the village come to life. Here and there, familiar figures moved with a renewed purpose. Mrs. Partridge, her composure restored, crossed the street toward the church hall, a small package tucked under her arm, the doll's house, now safely boxed and wrapped in linen for delivery to its new home in the parish collection. Its tiny red door was securely clasped. The dagger and key returned to their velvet-lined compartment, a guardian lock ensuring no further mischief. Miss Partridge paused at the gate and waved. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she called, her voice steadier than it had been in days. "Thank you for everything." Miss Marple inclined her head. "You displayed courage and dignity, my dear. Your loss has been repaired by your steadfastness," with a warm smile. Partridge continued on her way, her steps light. A few paces off, Lawrence Hayward walked alongside Constable Finch. The young man's shoulders were squared, his stride measured. He had spent the night in an upstairs room at the Crown and Thistle, tending to interviews with the magistrate, but he appeared more tranquil now, accepting of the consequences of his actions. Finch gave him a friendly nod. "I've arranged for your belongings to be transferred to the station. You'll want to pack anything you need." Hayward paused beneath an elm. He looked toward the vicarage with a faint catch in his breath. "Thank you, Harold. I have behaved shamefully, but I owe you my gratitude for fairness." Finch rested a hand on his arm. "We all make mistakes. Yours taught us to be vigilant and perhaps kinder." Hayward managed a small, grateful smile and continued on. At the Crown and Thistle itself, Mrs. Potts stood behind the bar, pouring tea for Dr. Lambert, who had delayed his rounds to join the closing ceremonies of the fair. He raised his cup in salute. "Thank you, Winifred," he said, "for your meticulous care of the evidence and of this village." Potts accepted his thanks with a modest nod. "It was my duty, Doctor, but now, I hope, we may all rest easier." Dr. Lambert glanced out the window at the empty lawn. "Lives have resumed their ordinary course, and yet, little Dismore will remember this spring for some time." She folded her arms. "Indeed, but perhaps we have grown stronger for it." Across the street, Mrs. Cumberbatch's motor car waited. She stood by its door, head in hand, gazing at the vicarage with an expression of quiet reflection. Miss Marple approached, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Good morning," she said. "I trust you slept after the events." Cumberbatch sighed, restlessly, but at peace. "I owe you an apology for the distress I caused." Miss Marple refused the apology with an imperceptible gesture. "True courage is acknowledging one's errors. You acted to reclaim what you believed was rightfully yours, but you did not harm an innocent soul." The widow's eyes brimmed. "I can only hope the parish will forgive me as you have." Miss Marple smiled. "They will, and you have been most generous in donating the proceeds of the auction to the hall's restoration." Cumberbatch looked surprised, then pleased. "I insisted on that. If the house remains here, it should serve the community it entertained." They parted with a mutual nod, each heart lightened by understanding. By midday, the church hall was alive with music and laughter. As the villagers gathered for the hunger banquet, a tradition marking the fair's end, tables groaned under platters of cold meats, fresh bread, pickles, and jellies. Children chased one another among the tables, while the elderly found seats by the windows, content to watch and chat. Miss Marple, invited as honored guest, sat beside the vicar and his wife, knitting in her lap but listening to every conversation. The Aldrich family, newly parents to a healthy baby, sat near the dais, where the doll's house had once stood, a reminder of the drama that had unfolded. Dr. Lambert paused to feed bits of cake to the infant, his gentle professionalism restored to its usual calm. across the table. Mrs. Potts and Mrs. Partridge chatted about floral arrangements for next year's festival. Lawrence Hayward lingered at the edge of the gathering, observing the happiness around him, a wistful look in his eyes, but also a flicker of hope for redemption. Miss Marple sipped her tea, then set down her cup and stood. The room grew hushed as villagers noticed her at the daisy's edge. She raised a hand in mild admonishment. "Thank you all for your kindness and your company," she began. "This fair, so long a symbol of our village's unity, was imperiled by one man's folly. Yet through vigilance, compassion, and a willingness to seek the truth even when it revealed uncomfortable truths about ourselves, we have preserved what is precious, our trust in one another." A ripple of applause ran through the hall. She continued, "Let this doll's house stand in the parish hall as a testament not only to craftsmanship, but to the strength of our community. May it remind us that even the smallest details, threads, keys, daggers can carry great weight, and that justice and mercy must walk hand in hand." As she concluded, the villagers cheered, and the band struck up a cheerful tune. Miss Marple stepped aside, her gaze lifting to the sunlight streaming through the windows, catching motes of dust like golden stars. Later, as the fair wound down and twilight painted the sky in pinks and purples, Miss Marple strolled the quiet lanes toward home. She paused at the old mill stream and knelt, letting the cool water swirl between her fingers. There she gently placed the scrap of parchment EL upon a smooth stone. The current caught it, carrying it away to join the river's flow like a secret finally laid to rest. She rose, brushing grass seeds from her skirts, and made her way back through the hedgerows. Behind her, the laughter of the feast still drifted on the breeze, mingling with bird calls and the faint tinkle of evening bells. At her gate, Miss Marple paused, turning to look back at the village she cherished. In the windows of the vicarage, lights glimmered warmly. In the distance, the church spire stood sentinel against the darkening sky. She closed her eyes, listening to the soft cadence of lives renewed. Justice had been done, hearts had been forgiven, and little Dismore would sleep safely once more, cradled by the gentle wisdom of its quietest observer. And in that stillness, Miss Marple smiled, knowing that while human nature may be fraught with frailty, it is redeemed always by empathy, by honesty, and by the simple courage to look beneath the surface for the truth.